I have always thought that being alone at night feels different from being alone during the day. During the day, an empty place feels peaceful. At night, the same place feels wrong. The shadows are deeper. Every sound seems louder. Small things that normally mean nothing suddenly catch your attention. A creak, a footstep, a door moving, the sound of something falling somewhere in the dark. Most of the time there is a simple explanation. Most of the time, the night that changed how I think about being alone happened 3 years ago. I was 24 years old and living by myself in a small rental house on the edge of town. The neighborhood was quiet. There were only a few houses on the street. Behind my house was a large empty field filled with tall grass and weeds. Beyond that was a line of trees that stretched for what felt like forever. The house itself was old. Not haunted. Not creepy. Just old. The floors creaked when I walked. The wooden walls sometimes popped when the temperature changed. The windows rattled during strong winds. I had lived there for almost 8 months and knew every sound the house made. That was why what happened that night scared me so badly. It was a Friday in late October. The weather had been cold all day. Gray clouds covered the sky from morning until sunset. By the time darkness arrived, the temperature had dropped even more. The wind outside was steady, not strong enough to be a storm, just strong enough to make tree branches scrape against one another. I came home from work around 6 in the evening. Nothing felt unusual. I heated leftovers, watched videos online, cleaned a few dishes, and spent some time scrolling through my phone. The hours passed normally. At around 11:30, I locked the front door, checked the windows, turned off most of the lights, and got ready for bed. I remember feeling tired. The kind of tired where your eyes burn slightly from staring at screens all day. I brushed my teeth, changed clothes, and climbed into bed. My bedroom was at the back of the house. There was a single window facing the field behind the property. I usually kept the curtains closed at night. Something about looking into a completely dark field always made me uncomfortable. I turned off the lamp beside my bed. The room became completely dark. The only light came from the digital clock across the room. 12:02 a.m. I rolled onto my side and closed my eyes. At first everything felt normal. The wind outside, the occasional creak from the house settling, the distant sound of traffic from a highway several miles away. Then I heard a noise, a metallic sound, very faint, clink. My eyes opened immediately. I stayed still. The sound had come from somewhere outside. I listened carefully. Nothing. For almost a minute there was complete silence. I started convincing myself I imagined it. Then I heard it again. Clink. It sounded like metal lightly hitting metal. I sat up in bed. The sound seemed to be coming from behind the house. Maybe from the backyard. I checked my phone. 12:19 a.m. I listened again. Nothing. The silence stretched on long enough that I started feeling stupid. I lay back down. A few moments later the sound returned. Clink. Clink. This time it was clearer. Definitely outside. Definitely close. A cold feeling spread through my chest. I told myself it was probably something simple. Maybe the wind was moving a loose piece of metal. Maybe a neighbor had left something outside. Maybe an animal had knocked something over. There were plenty of explanations. Still, I couldn't ignore it. I got out of bed. The floor felt cold beneath my feet. I walked to the window and carefully moved one side of the curtain. The field behind the house was pitch black. There were no streetlights back there. No houses. No light at all. The darkness looked solid. Like a wall. I pressed closer to the glass. At first I saw nothing. Then I noticed something near the fence. Movement. A shape. My heart jumped. I froze. The shape moved again. Then it disappeared. I stared so hard that my eyes started hurting. A few seconds later I realized what I had seen. Tall grass moving in the wind. Nothing more. I laughed quietly at myself. The tension faded. I closed the curtain. As I turned away from the window, another sound came from outside. This time it wasn't metal. It sounded like a gate opening. A long, rusty squeak. I stopped immediately. The sound had come from the side yard. I knew that sound. There was a metal gate leading into my backyard. and I knew exactly how it sounded when someone opened it, because I heard it every day. My stomach tightened. I stood completely still. The house suddenly felt much larger than usual. Every room seemed distant. Every shadow seemed darker. I waited. No more sounds came. I walked into the hallway. The darkness there felt different. The living room was visible at the far end. Moonlight leaked through one of the front windows. Everything looked gray, silent, empty. I checked the time again. 12:31 a.m. I considered going outside. That idea lasted about 2 seconds. Instead, I locked my bedroom door and returned to bed. I told myself I was being paranoid. The gate was old. The wind could have moved it. That explanation made sense. Eventually I fell asleep. Or at least I think I did. I woke suddenly. My heart was already racing before I even understood why. For a few seconds I lay there confused. The room was dark, silent. Then I heard it. A thump. Somewhere inside the house. Not outside. Inside. I sat upright immediately. The digital clock showed 2:14 a.m. I listened. Nothing. The silence felt heavy. Then another sound came. A soft scrape. Like something dragging across the floor. I stopped breathing for a moment. Every nerve in my body felt awake. The sound came from somewhere near the kitchen. I knew the layout of the house well enough to estimate where it was. The kitchen was on the opposite side of the building. There shouldn't have been anyone there. I lived alone. No pets. No roommates. Nobody else had a key. The scraping sound came again. Longer this time. Slow. Controlled. Not random. Not the sound of something falling. Not the sound of a house settling. It sounded intentional. I grabbed my phone. No signal issue. Battery nearly full. I considered calling the police immediately. But what would I tell them? That I heard a noise? That wasn't enough. I needed to know if someone was actually inside. I got out of bed and picked up the heavy flashlight I kept in a drawer. My hands were shaking. The hallway outside my bedroom felt colder than before. I moved slowly. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness. Every room looked empty. The bathroom. The laundry room. The small office. Nothing. The silence returned. I reached the living room. My heart was pounding so hard that I could hear it. The kitchen entrance was directly ahead. Dark. Still. I stepped forward. One step. Then another. The flashlight beam swept across the floor. Across the counter. Across the sink. Nothing. No movement. No person. No sign that anyone had been there. I stood motionless. Listening. The refrigerator hummed softly. The clock ticked. That was all. I felt embarrassed. Again. Maybe I had dreamed the sounds. Maybe I woke halfway through a nightmare. That seemed possible. Then I noticed something strange. One of the kitchen windows was slightly open. Only a few inches. But open. I stared at it. I was certain I had locked every window before bed. Certain. The cold night air drifted inside. A chill ran down my spine. I walked closer. The window lock was unlocked. Not broken. Unlocked. My mouth felt dry. I checked the ground beneath the window. Nothing obvious. No footprints. No mud. No sign of entry. Still, I locked it immediately. Then I checked every other window. All secure. All locked. I searched the entire house. Closets. Bathroom. Storage areas. Every room. Nothing. No one. Eventually I returned to bed. But sleep never really came back. I spent the next hour staring at the ceiling. Listening. Waiting. At around 4 in the morning exhaustion finally won. I drifted off. The next morning sunlight filled the house. Everything looked normal again. The fear felt ridiculous. Almost embarrassing. I made coffee. Ate breakfast. Tried convincing myself the whole thing had been stress. Then I walked outside. The moment I reached the backyard, I stopped. The gate was open. Wide open. I stared at it. The wind wasn't strong enough to force it open that far. Not even close. The metal latch hung loosely against the fence. I felt uneasy again. I walked across the yard. The grass was damp from overnight moisture. Near the back fence I noticed something else. A footprint. Then another. Then another. They were faint, but visible. Someone had been there. The prints led toward the field. My chest tightened. I followed them carefully. The farther they went, the harder they became to see. Eventually they disappeared among the weeds. I stood there for several minutes. The field stretched endlessly before me. Empty. Silent. Nothing moved except the grass. I returned inside. For the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. Someone had been in my backyard. That much seemed obvious. But had they entered the house? Or only looked around? I had no answers. That night, I made sure every door and window was locked. I checked them 3 times. I left several lights on. I kept the flashlight beside me. For hours, everything remained quiet. Midnight came and went. 1 o'clock. 2 o'clock. Nothing happened. Eventually, I started relaxing. Maybe whoever had been outside was gone. Maybe they would never come back. At 2:47 a.m., I heard the sound again. The gate. The exact same rusty squeak. My entire body went cold. I sat upright instantly. This time I didn't move toward the window. I stayed in bed and listened. The sound came again. Then silence. Then something much worse. Footsteps. Slow footsteps. Crunching across the backyard. Getting closer. Every sound seemed impossibly loud. Crunch. 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 The footsteps stopped directly outside the house. Couldn't breathe. I stared toward the dark curtain covering the window. The person was on the other side. Only a few feet away. I knew it. The silence that followed felt endless. Then I heard something touch the glass. A faint tap. My heart nearly stopped. Another tap followed. Then another. Slow. Patient. Not someone trying to break in. Someone testing. Checking. Seeing if anyone was awake. I remained completely still. The taps stopped. A full minute passed. Then another. Eventually I heard footsteps moving away. Crunch. 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 The gate squeaked again. Then everything became silent. I didn't sleep at all after that. When morning arrived, I called the police. An officer came later that day. I explained everything. The noises. The footprints. The tapping. He walked around the property. Examined the yard. Checked the fence. Then he found something. Near the rear corner of the house. Hidden among bushes. A small folding chair. Old. Dirty. Weathered. The officer looked at it for a long moment. Then he searched the surrounding area. A few minutes later he found empty water bottles. Food wrappers. Cigarette butts. Someone had been spending time there. A lot of time. Watching the house. The realization made me sick. A stranger hadn't just wandered through my yard. Someone had been observing me. Learning my routine. Watching when lights turned on and off. Watching when I came home. Watching when I left. The officer believed it might have been a homeless person using the area temporarily. But even he didn't sound fully convinced. The location of the chair bothered him. It had a clear view of my bedroom window. That night police increased patrols around the area. I felt safer. But not safe. A week passed. No sounds. No footprints. Nothing unusual. Life slowly returned to normal. Then one evening I came home from work and noticed my mailbox standing open. I thought little of it. Until I checked inside. There was no mail. Not unusual. But something was sitting at the bottom. A photograph. My hands immediately felt numb. The picture showed my house. Taken from the field behind it. The photo looked recent. Very recent. The lights were on inside. I was visible through the living room window. Standing there. The date printed in the corner showed it had been taken only 4 days earlier. I stared at it for a long time. My stomach twisted. Someone had photographed me. Someone had been close enough to see inside my house. I called the police again. This time the response was much more serious. Investigators became involved. The photograph changed everything. Now there was proof. Someone had been watching. The area behind the house was searched. More evidence was found. A hidden campsite deep among the trees. Blankets. Food containers. Batteries. Old clothing. and dozens of photographs. Most showed houses. Several showed mine. Some had been taken through windows. Some were taken late at night. Some were taken during the day. The person had been watching for months. The police eventually identified him. He was a drifter with a long history of trespassing and stalking behavior. No murders. No kidnappings. No dramatic crimes. Just years of disturbing incidents involving watching people. Following routines. Entering properties. Remaining hidden. The police believed he had likely entered my house through the unlocked kitchen window the first night. They believed the sounds I heard were real. The scrape. The thump. Everything. He had probably left when he realized someone was awake. When officers finally arrested him several towns away, they found more photographs from multiple neighborhoods. Mine wasn't the only house. Not even close. The investigation continued for months. I eventually moved away. Not because the danger remained. The man was in custody. The threat was gone. But the house never felt normal again. Every room reminded me of those nights. Every creak brought back memories. Even during daylight. Especially when I looked toward the field. Today, years later, I still think about it sometimes. The part that stays with me isn't the photograph. It isn't the campsite. It isn't even the knowledge that someone entered my home. What stays with me is the moment I stood by my bedroom window and looked into that darkness. I thought I was alone. I thought the field was empty. I thought nothing was there. But someone was already watching. Silent. Patient. Only a few yards away. For days afterward, I kept replaying that thought in my head. Every normal evening suddenly seemed different. Every time I had walked through my living room. Every time I had sat on the couch. Every time I had cooked dinner or fallen asleep. Someone may have been watching from that field. The police later estimated he had likely been there for weeks before I noticed anything unusual. That meant he had probably seen hundreds of ordinary moments from my life. Moments I assumed were private. Moments I never imagined another person was quietly observing. That realization bothered me more than anything else. After moving away, I rented an apartment in a busy part of town. There were neighbors everywhere. Streetlights outside every night. Cars passing constantly. At first, all the noise felt annoying. Then it became comforting. Silence no longer felt peaceful to me. Silence reminded me of that field. Months later, the court case ended. The man received a prison sentence because of multiple charges connected to trespassing, stalking, and other incidents discovered during the investigation. The police contacted me once everything was finalized. That call gave me closure. The situation was over. Completely over. There would be no surprise return. No unresolved mystery. No unanswered questions. The person responsible had been identified, arrested, and convicted. The story had an ending. A real ending. Even so, some habits never disappeared. I still check locks before bed. I still notice strange sounds more than most people. And whenever I stay somewhere isolated, I always close the curtains after dark. Not because I believe something supernatural is outside. Not because I expect danger. But because I learned something that night. Being alone and feeling alone are two different things. For most of my life, when I sat in a quiet room at night, I assumed I was the only person there. Now I know that assumption can be wrong. The scariest thing I have ever experienced wasn't a ghost, a monster, or anything impossible. It was something completely real. A stranger, patient stranger, watching from the darkness while I convinced myself I was alone. And that is exactly why, even years later, it still scares me. I didn't think anything bad would happen that night. That's how it always starts, I guess. Nothing feels dangerous until it already is. I was alone in the house. Not in a dramatic way. Not like in movies where everything feels silent and cursed. It was just a normal night. The kind of night where the world outside feels slowed down. Like even the air is tired. My parents had gone to visit relatives in another city and would be back in 2 days. I had stayed behind because I had work. And honestly, I liked being alone sometimes. Felt peaceful. The house wasn't small, but it also wasn't fancy. 2 floors, a narrow staircase, and rooms that always felt slightly colder at night no matter the season. The electricity in our area used to cut off sometimes, but that night it was steady. Everything was normal. I spent most of the evening in my room upstairs. My laptop was open, a video playing in the background that I wasn't really watching. I was scrolling on my phone, half paying attention to messages, half thinking about random things like food and sleep and work for the next day. Around midnight, I started feeling tired. Not the kind of tired where you just fall asleep instantly, but the slow kind that pulls your body down. My eyes felt heavy, my neck stiff from sitting in the same position too long. I remember looking at the time and thinking I should sleep soon. That's when I first noticed something small. The house made a sound. Not a normal sound like wood settling or wind brushing against the walls. It was sharper, like something light had touched the stairs. I paused and listened. Nothing followed it. I told myself it was nothing. Houses make noise all the time, especially at night. I went back to my phone. A few minutes later, I heard it again. This time it was clearer. A soft creak from the staircase. 1 step, then silence. My fingers stopped moving. I turned my head slightly toward the door of my room, but I didn't stand up. I just listened. Still nothing. I started thinking maybe it was the house settling, or maybe some small animal outside near the foundation. We sometimes had cats walking around the roof or pigeons landing in strange places. I tried to ignore it, but then came a third sound. This one was different. It wasn't the stairs exactly. It was closer to the hallway outside my room. A slow, careful pressure sound, like someone trying not to make noise but failing slightly. Like weight shifting from one foot to another. I felt a small discomfort in my chest. I told myself again it was nothing. I even smiled a little at how easily my mind was jumping to conclusions. Being alone can make you overthink. That's normal. Still, I got up. Not because I was scared, but because I wanted to check and prove to myself it was nothing. I slowly opened my door. The hallway was dark, but not completely black. There was light from outside the house coming through a small window at the end of the corridor. It created a thin, gray strip across the floor. The rest was shadows. Everything looked normal. No movement. No sound. I stood there for a few seconds, listening carefully. My heart was beating a little faster now, but I still told myself it was just my imagination. I closed the door again and went back inside. I tried to continue what I was doing, but now I was more aware of the house. Every small sound felt louder. The ticking of the clock downstairs. The faint hum of the refrigerator. Even my own breathing seemed too noticeable. I checked the time again. 12:37 a.m. I decided I should just sleep. I turned off my laptop, put my phone aside, and lay down. The room was quiet, but not peaceful anymore. There's a difference between silence that feels natural and silence that feels like it's waiting. I pulled the blanket over myself and closed my eyes. For a while, nothing happened. I was drifting between sleep and wakefulness, that strange in-between state where thoughts become slow and unclear. Then I heard it again. A sound from downstairs this time. A soft thud, like something had been placed on the floor. My eyes opened immediately. I didn't move, just listened. Another sound followed. Slight dragging. Slow. Careful. My throat felt dry suddenly. Now my mind started working differently. I wasn't thinking about ghosts or anything unrealistic. My thoughts were simple and sharp. Someone is in the house. That idea made my body go still. I slowly sat up in bed, trying not to make noise. I listened again. Nothing. But I knew what I heard. The house wasn't large. If someone was inside, there weren't many places they could go without being noticed. Kitchen downstairs, living room, small storage area under the stairs, and the main door. I tried to think logically. Maybe someone entered by mistake. Maybe a neighbor. Maybe the door wasn't locked properly. I remembered locking it. I was almost sure. I stayed in my room for a few minutes, trying to decide what to do. My mind kept going between 2 options. Stay quiet and wait or go check. Waiting felt worse. Not knowing felt worse. I slowly got out of bed. My feet touched the cold floor. I stood still for a moment, listening again. No sound. I opened my room door very slowly. The hallway was the same as before, but now it felt heavier. The shadows looked deeper, like they were sitting still on purpose. I stepped out quietly. Each step I took toward the staircase felt like it took longer than it should have. My hand brushed the wall for balance, and I realized my palm was slightly sweaty. Halfway down the stairs, I stopped. There was a faint light coming from the kitchen downstairs. Not bright, just a weak glow. That was not normal. I hadn't left any light on. My stomach tightened. I stayed still, watching the bottom of the stairs. My brain tried to make sense of it quickly. Maybe I forgot to turn it off. Maybe I left it on earlier. But I knew I hadn't been downstairs since evening. I continued slowly, one step at a time, trying not to let the stairs creak. Each step felt louder than the last. When I reached the bottom, I stayed close to the wall and looked toward the kitchen. The light was definitely on. It wasn't the main light. It was the small bulb above the sink area. The kitchen looked empty. From where I stood, I could see part of the counter, the fridge, and the table. Nothing was moving, but the feeling in my chest didn't go away. I stayed there for a long time, just watching. Then I noticed something small that made my breathing tighten. The back door of the kitchen was slightly open. Not wide open, just a small gap. That door leads to the small backyard. I know I closed it earlier in the evening. I remembered pulling it shut because of mosquitoes. Now it was open. A cold feeling spread through my body, but I still forced myself to move forward. Slowly, I entered the kitchen. The floor felt colder than the rest of the house. I walked carefully, looking around, checking corners, behind the fridge, under the table. Nothing. No movement. No person. But the air felt different, like it had been disturbed recently. I walked toward the back door. As I got closer, I could feel a faint draft of cold air coming from outside. The door swayed slightly as I approached it. I stopped right in front of it. My hand hesitated before touching the handle. I looked outside into the backyard. It was dark. Very dark. The kind of darkness where you can't see shape or distance properly. Only vague outlines. I opened the door a little more. The metal hinge made a soft sound that felt too loud. I stepped slightly outside, just enough to see the yard. Empty. No movement. No one there. The gate at the far end was closed. The walls were still. Everything looked normal, but I didn't feel normal. I closed the door again quickly and locked it. My heart was beating faster now. I stood in the kitchen trying to calm myself. I told myself again. Maybe the door was left slightly open and wind pushed it. Maybe the light was left on by mistake. Maybe everything had a simple explanation. But I couldn't ignore the earlier sounds. The stairs. The hallway. The downstairs movement. Something had been inside the house. I decided I needed to check every room downstairs properly before going back up. I started with the living room. It was empty. Couch, table, TV. Nothing out of place. Then the small storage area under the stairs. Empty. Then the bathroom downstairs. Empty. Each room confirmed nothing, but instead of making me feel better, it made me feel worse. Because it meant I was missing something. Something that didn't want to be seen. I went back to the living room and stood still for a moment. That's when I heard it again. A sound from upstairs. A soft step. Right above me. I froze completely. The sound was slow and deliberate, like someone walking across the upstairs hallway. My throat tightened. I hadn't gone upstairs again after coming down, which meant something else had. I didn't move immediately. I just listened. Another step. Then silence. Then another step. Moving closer to the staircase. My entire body went cold. I slowly backed away from the stairs, keeping my eyes fixed on them. I didn't know what to do. Running upstairs didn't make sense. Staying downstairs didn't feel safe either. Then I made a decision. I moved toward the front door as quietly as I could. I unlocked it slowly, making sure not to make noise. The outside air hit me immediately when I opened it. Felt fresh, real, normal. That alone almost made me want to step out right away. But I stopped and looked back inside one last time. The staircase was still. No movement. No sound. But I knew I wasn't alone in the house. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me without slamming it. I stood in the front yard for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to understand what was happening. The street was quiet. A few distant lights from other houses. No people outside. I called a neighbor from outside using my phone. I kept it simple. I said I thought someone might be inside my house. Within a few minutes, someone came over with a flashlight. Another neighbor joined. Then another. When we entered the house together, everything was silent. They checked upstairs first, then downstairs, then every room. Nothing. No person. No sign of forced entry. The back door was still slightly loose, which they said might have been wind. The upstairs hallway was empty. No footprints. No disturbance. They told me it might have been my imagination, or fatigue, or just sounds carrying in strange ways at night. They checked everything twice. Eventually, they left after making sure the house was locked properly. But I stayed outside for a while longer before going back in. When I finally entered again, I checked everything myself again. Slowly. Nothing had changed. Everything was exactly as it should be. Except I now knew something I didn't before. The house could feel empty and still not be safe. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I stayed in the living room with the lights on until morning. And when the sun came up, I checked every lock again, every window again, every door again. I even checked places twice just to be sure. Nothing was there. No intruder was ever found. But the important part wasn't that something had been there or not. The important part was that I had heard it clearly in a house that should have been empty. And I had made the right choice when I left. Because whatever it was, it didn't want to be seen. And I didn't stay long enough to find out what would have happened if I had. After finishing the check, I returned to the living room and sat down again. I was starting to feel mentally tired in a way that wasn't the same as physical tiredness. Felt like my focus was wearing down. That is when the most unsettling part of the night happened. I was sitting quietly when I realized I couldn't hear the refrigerator anymore. At first, I thought maybe I had just gotten used to it and stopped noticing. But when I focused, I realized the sound was completely gone. I stood up and listened carefully. The house was suddenly very quiet. Not peaceful quiet. The kind of quiet that feels unnatural because you know it wasn't like that before. I walked toward the kitchen again. Halfway there, I noticed something else. The living room light behind me flickered slightly. Just once. Very fast. Could have been nothing. Old wiring, normal electrical issue. But combined with everything else, it felt significant. I continued walking. When I reached the kitchen, I saw that the refrigerator light was still on. But the machine itself wasn't making any sound. That alone shouldn't have felt strange. But it did. Machines don't usually go completely silent like that. I stood in front of it for a while, trying to understand what I was feeling. There was no logical explanation for fear in that moment, but my body reacted anyway. I opened the fridge door just to check if everything was working. The cold air came out normally. The shelves were normal. Everything was normal. But behind me, in the hallway, I heard a sound again. This time it was clearer. A slow, deliberate creak of the floor. Not random. Not settling. Something that sounded like weight shifting carefully. I turned immediately. The hallway was empty. But the silence after that felt different. Like it had been interrupted by intention. I stayed still, watching the hallway for a long time. My mind tried to explain it again. House movement. Pipes. Old wood. Anything logical. But none of those explanations matched the way it sounded. After a while, I forced myself to move again. I turned on every light I could reach. Kitchen. Hallway. Living room. Bathroom. Every switch I could find. The house became bright, almost aggressively so. And yet I still didn't feel safe. Eventually, I made a decision. I would stay in one room only, lock myself in, and wait for morning. Not because I believed anything was inside the house, but because my mind needed consistency. I chose my bedroom because it had the strongest lock. I went in, closed the door, and sat on the bed. The silence inside the room was different from the rest of the house. Smaller, more controlled. but I still heard things faintly through the walls. Pipes, wind, the house adjusting itself. I stayed awake, watching the door. Time moved slowly again. Hours passed like that. At one point, I almost convinced myself everything had been imagination, that I had just been overthinking because I was alone. That is how these nights usually end in hindsight. You feel silly the next day, but just before dawn, something happened that made it impossible to dismiss everything. The hallway light outside my room turned off. I know I did not do it. I remember sitting up immediately, staring at the gap under the door. The light had been on for a long time. I had checked it multiple times, and now it was off. I didn't move for a while. My mind went completely still in a way it hadn't all night. Not even fear at first. Just focus. Waiting. Then I heard something again. A slow sound outside my room. Not loud. Not rushing. Just steady movement along the hallway. It stopped directly in front of my door. I stayed silent. No thoughts. No conclusions. Just awareness. Then, after a long pause, I heard something simple. The faint sound of the hallway light switch being pressed. The light turned on again. I didn't open the door immediately. I waited until I could hear normal morning sounds outside. Birds starting, distant movement from the street, the world returning to normal life. When I finally opened the door, nothing was there. The hallway was empty. The lights were on. Everything looked exactly as it should. The front door of the house was still locked from the inside, exactly how I had left it. There were no signs of anyone entering or leaving. No damage. No mess. Nothing missing. But the experience changed something in me. Not in a dramatic way, but in a clear one. I realized how easily silence and isolation can distort perception. How a normal house at night can feel completely unfamiliar when you are alone long enough to start noticing every small sound and gap. I checked everything again in daylight. Every room. Every lock. Every window. Nothing was wrong. The refrigerator was working normally again, making its usual soft sound. The hallway light switch behaved normally. The house was just a house again. That is what made it clear. Nothing had actually happened that couldn't be explained. But something had still happened to me internally. My sense of normal changed in a way that was hard to reverse. I understood how being alone at night doesn't need anything supernatural or unreal to feel frightening. It only needs silence, attention, and time. After that night, I started planning differently. I stopped staying up late without reason. I made sure there was always some kind of background sound if I was alone. I didn't do it because I believed something was out there. I did it because I learned how easily the mind can turn an empty, quiet house into something that feels completely unfamiliar. And I never ignored that feeling again. I was alone at night the first time I really understood how different a place can feel when the sun is gone. Not just darker, but heavier, like the air itself becomes closer and the world shrinks around you. I had always heard people say that night changes things, but I never took it seriously until I experienced it myself in a way that stayed with me long after. It started on a normal day that didn't feel important at all. Nothing strange had happened in the morning or afternoon. I had gone through my usual routine, wasted time on my phone, and told myself I would fix my sleeping schedule tomorrow. Like always. By evening, everyone in my house had gone out for different reasons, and I was left alone without planning for it. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal. I had been alone before, but usually it was daytime, or at least I knew someone would be back soon. That night felt different from the beginning, even before anything happened. The sky had that dull gray-blue color that comes right after sunset, when everything looks quiet but not peaceful. The light in the house started to fade slowly, and I didn't bother turning on the main lights at first. I stayed in the half-darkness, moving from room to room, hearing small sounds that I usually ignored. The house creaked in ways I had never noticed before. Pipes made soft ticking noises inside the walls. The refrigerator hummed like it was louder than usual. At first, I told myself it was normal. Houses always make noise. But the longer I stayed alone, the more I started paying attention to everything. I remember walking through the hallway and feeling like it was longer than it should have been. That was the first strange feeling I had. Not fear exactly, just a small discomfort that I couldn't explain. The hallway lights were off, and the only light came from the living room behind me, stretching shadows forward like something was waiting at the other end. I went back and turned on more lights after that. The house looked normal again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks because I was alone. That is something people always say, and I used to believe it completely. Later in the night, I made food even though I wasn't really hungry. I didn't want to sit in silence, so I turned on the TV just for background noise. The sound made the house feel less empty, but it didn't remove the feeling completely. It only covered it like putting a thin blanket over something cold. Every few minutes, I found myself looking toward the hallway without meaning to. I don't know why. Nothing had happened there. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. But my attention kept drifting in that direction. Time moved strangely that night. It didn't feel like hours were passing in a normal way. It felt like I was stuck in the same moment, repeating small actions just to keep myself occupied. Sit down, stand up, check the phone, walk to the kitchen, drink water even when I wasn't thirsty. At some point, I noticed that the outside had become completely dark. Not just evening dark, but deep night dark. The kind where you can't see anything through the windows except reflections of your own room. That was when the house felt the most different. The windows started to feel like they were not just letting me see out, but also letting something look in. I know that sounds irrational, but that is how it felt. Every reflection looked slightly delayed, like it wasn't matching me perfectly. I would move my head, and for a fraction of a second, it felt like the reflection didn't follow correctly. I stopped sitting near the windows after that. Instead, I stayed in the living room with all the lights on. I told myself I was just tired. Lack of sleep can make things feel strange. I had experienced that before, but this felt deeper than tiredness. Felt like awareness, like I was noticing things I normally ignored. At one point, I heard a sound from the kitchen. It was very small, not a clear noise, more like something very light touching a surface, like plastic shifting or something brushing against the counter. I froze immediately, not because I thought something impossible was happening, but because I knew I hadn't made that sound. I sat still and listened. For a while, there was nothing else. Just silence again. The kind of silence that makes your ears feel like they are straining too hard. Then I convinced myself it was nothing. Houses do that. Things settle. Maybe something fell. I forced myself to stand up and check. Walking into the kitchen felt different than earlier. The air felt colder even though I knew the temperature hadn't changed. The light from the living room didn't reach all the corners, so parts of the kitchen stayed in shadow. Everything looked normal. Nothing was out of place. Nothing on the counter had moved. The sink was dry. The chairs were exactly where they had been. I stood there longer than necessary, just to be sure. My mind kept trying to find a cause for what I heard. I almost convinced myself I imagined it. Almost. When I turned back, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten slightly. The hallway light, which I was sure I had turned on earlier, was now off. I stopped for a second. I tried to remember if I had actually turned it on or just thought about it. Memory gets unclear when you are alone and distracted. I told myself I probably never turned it on in the first place. Still, I didn't like it. I walked back and turned it on again. The hallway looked the same as before, but now it felt more narrow. That feeling returned stronger than earlier, like the space had changed even though I knew it hadn't. I went back to the living room and tried to ignore it. Time continued passing in small, broken pieces. I checked my phone repeatedly, even though nothing was happening on it. I didn't want to fall into silence again, because every time I did, the house felt more present. At some point, I started hearing very faint sounds that I couldn't fully identify. Not footsteps, not voices, just small noises that could easily be dismissed individually, but together they formed a pattern that made me uneasy. A tap somewhere in another room, a soft creak from above, a brief sound like fabric shifting, even though nothing was there. I started turning up the TV volume. It helped, but only a little. The worst part was not knowing whether the sounds were real or not. That uncertainty slowly builds something inside your mind that is hard to control. I kept telling myself that if anything was actually wrong, it would be obvious. People always think that danger announces itself clearly. But that night made me question that idea. At one point, I decided to check every room in the house properly. Not because I believed someone was there, but because I wanted to stop my own mind from inventing things. Room by room, I went through the house. Bedroom, empty. Bed untouched. Bathroom, nothing unusual. Water pipes quiet. Another bedroom, dark, silent, normal. Everything was exactly how it should be. And yet I still didn't feel reassured. The strange feeling didn't come from what I saw. Came from what I didn't see. From the gaps between rooms. From the moments when I turned away from one space and walked into another. It felt like something was always just outside my attention.